Hello, everyone. My name is Onno van Hoed, and recently I, along with some colleagues of mine, completed an umbrella review, which is to say a literature review of literature reviews on the topic of gender in STEM education. And the goal of this was to provide a bit of an overview of all the research that was done on gender in STEM education. Through this, we obtained some that we believe are very interesting insights, and today I would like to share these with you. I would like to specifically talk to you today about the concept of gender, a little bit about science communication. I'd like to talk about the issue of equality versus equity. I'd like to talk about the gender gap as we know it and what it means. And I'd like to talk about intersectionality. That's the final thing. So, first off, the concept of gender. The first and perhaps the most important conclusion of our umbrella review is the fact that gender as a concept is very inconsistently conceptualized in research, even in research that, concerns gender in STEM. So, very often, gender is described in research as something that is basically synonymous to biological sex. That is to say, gender is fixed and binary. Someone is either a male or a female. Someone is either a man or a woman, and that is that. You can't change that, and there's nothing else. But what we would like to argue and what we would like to fight for is a conceptualization of gender as more of a social concept and more of a performance, something that is not fixed. That is to say, it is not just you are a male or you are a female, and something that is not binary. So that is to say, we want a conceptualization of gender with gender as a performance. And you can choose to perform either more feminine or masculine, somewhere in between, mix and match. That is what we believe the concept of gender should be. But as it turns out, in most research concerning the topic, this is not the case. Most often, gender is still conceptualized as something fixed, as something binary, and as something synonymous with biological sex. So that also brings us to science communication, because we believe that bringing this conceptualization of gender as something performative, as a social concept, is also very important for us to bring to the general public. We believe that gender in this way should be shared with the general public. Because if even research thinks generally that gender is something fixed and binary, then why should we believe that the general public does not think the same thing? The general public usually gets their information on topics like this from the media. And the media currently, as we know it, is often very popular and often very sensational. And through this popular and sensational media, gender gets discussed quite a bit, usually in a very negative light. And in that way, they don't actually gain an understanding of what gender is. Most people in the general public will hear about gender. They'll hear about gender in a negative light. They'll think, oh, gender, gender is whether you're a man or a woman, and everything that's outside that is strange and maybe even scary. Because if you see gender as something fixed and something binary, then you will automatically assume that identities outside of this binary range, so whether that is transgender or whether that's intersex, that doesn't matter. The point is everything outside of this binary will be seen by the general public or by the researchers who do this as either strange, abnormal, unusual, or maybe even scary. So we believe that gender as a social concept, gender as something performative, as something non-fixed, non-binary, should be shared with the general public to broaden the views of gender. That also brings us to another point that we discovered during our umbrella review, which is the issue of equality versus equity. Very often, policy reports on gender, but also research on gender will use the word gender equality rather than gender equity. Sometimes the reports clearly actually mean gender equity, but oftentimes they also actually mean equality. To refresh, if you don't remember, or if you've never known, the difference between equality versus equity is quite simple. Let's imagine a fence. Let's imagine a fence of about 1 meter 50 high. Um, and we have a person who is tall enough to reach over this fence, and we have a person who is not tall enough to reach over this fence. In the concept of equality, what we would do is assume that both these people start out at the same point, and we would give them both a box that is equally high. If we do this, it would allow the taller person to reach over the fence. After all, he could already do that. But it would still not allow the less tall person, so the smaller person, to reach over the fence because the box is simply not tall enough. Because the assumption that everyone starts out at the exact same point is simply incorrect in real life. So what equity would do instead, equity would look at the different points that these people start at. They would go, okay, the taller person will need a smaller box or maybe no box at all, while the smaller person will need a bigger box to see over this fence. So equity would try to make sure that these people end up at the same point, rather than giving both people equal amounts of resources. They would give each person the resources they need to end up at equal points. And we believe that it is very important for gender to think of this as gender equity and not gender equality. Why that is important is revealed in the gender gap. The gender gap is very often used to describe the problem that we're dealing with. People say, researchers say, there is a gap. But there's a gap between what exactly? Well, researchers often say that the gender gap is a gap between women and men in STEM. There are less women than there are men in STEM, and thus we have a gap. And this gap is often seen as a numbers issue, a issue of equality as well. So the term gap seems to indicate that we are dealing with a numbers issue. There are less women than men in STEM, so the solution should obviously be to get more women into STEM. Because if we have the same amount of women as men in STEM, then we've solved the issue. We've solved the numbers issue. We've created an equal environment of an equal amount of women, an equal amount of men. But what they fail to realize or fail to engage with is the fact that STEM as an environment and science as an environment is not equitable. We are not, in fact, dealing with a numbers issue, is what our research shows. Our research shows that even if you have an equal amount of men and an equal amount of women in a STEM field, that does not make science culture itself equitable. We see, for example, that there is teacher bias. So teachers are more likely to engage with men in their classroom compared to women in STEM classrooms. In such a way, there is also just more sexism towards women. So we should remember that even if solutions geared at getting more women into STEM are on the outside only positive, the environment that we are trying to get these women into is in itself not equitable. And that is something that we should keep in mind, and that is something that we should try to fix first before trying to get more women into the STEM field. Now, finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about intersectionality. And I'd like to approach that in two different ways. First of all, studies, as we have seen in our umbrella review, often look at one factor on its own. So think, for example, about studies looking into stereotypes on women in STEM, or studies looking into teacher bias, or studies looking into confidence difference between men and women. And they often approach these factors as its own thing, and then they try to think of a solution for this one factor. And again, while that is outwardly only positive, in reality, all these factors are very much related, and all these factors very much influence each other. Stereotypes might influence confidence, confidence might influence stereotypes, stereotypes might influence teacher bias might influence confidence. So in approaching these factors as separate things and thinking of solutions for just one of these factors, we are prone to forget that these factors are in fact dependent on each other, and these factors are in fact interconnected. So what we believe we should do in future research is take a more holistic approach and look at these factors as one interconnected thing. On top of that, while we talk about gender, we should also not forget that gender is not a solitary factor. Ethnicity, socioeconomic status, disability, these are also all parts of our identity. And these play an important role in our connection to STEM. Women might, for example, or other sexual identities, gender identities, might have to overcome certain stereotypes to feel welcome in STEM. But someone who is both, for example, from a ethnicity or like poor, as a poor social economic status, might have to overcome both the stereotypes of being a woman and being from a minoritized ethnicity, or being a woman and being poor. So we should not forget that gender is not a solitary factor as well, and we should keep this in mind for future research. Now, those are, in short, the results of our umbrella review on gender in STEM education. If you want to reach out to me, you can reach me on the email address above, which is my work email, and I'll try to respond to any questions you may have or requests for collaboration. Let's see, you can reach out to me for anything that you would like. I would also like to point out that we are currently performing a project called Picture Your Path, which is about women in ICT. I have included the website to this project below. Please check it out if you are at all interested in the gender gap, women in ICT, and similar. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and for listening to my talk.